Well, absolutely fascinating watching that. I'm joined by three experts on marriage and social trends. Zaki Wahaj has done extensive research on this in India and Bangladesh. Brianna Pirelli-Harris has done similar work in Europe and America. And Karen Cinnamon is one of the UK's leading wedding bloggers. Thanks to all of you for being here with me to discuss this. Zaki, to you, first of all, I mean, what we saw in that piece, in that particular part of the world, quite rare. I mean, what is, for those people watching, roughly the average age for girls getting married, women getting married in that part of the world, India, Bangladesh?
So in India and Bangladesh, it would be about 2/3 of women who marry before the age of 18. In Pakistan, it's slightly higher. So I think the median age would be about 20. But there are a lot of marriages which are taking place among women when they're essentially adolescent girls.
And it's interesting, isn't it, because that actually hasn't changed over the last couple of decades, 20 years. Why, do you think? So
there have been a lot of dramatic changes for women in South Asia. Fertility has declined dramatically over this period. Female schooling has increased dramatically, so there are many more girls who are going to secondary school than they were 20 or 30 years ago. But compared to that, the trends in marriage patterns, so at the age at which they get married and the way that these marriages are arranged, have changed relatively little. And it is somewhat of a puzzle as to why the trends in marriage practices have changed so much more slowly.
Well, we'll come back to perhaps try to unravel that puzzle. Sure. But Brianna, it's interesting listening to that in terms of the lack of change in that part of the world. When you compare it to Europe, hurtling towards change on this particular issue.
Yes, very much so. Pretty much every country in Europe has experienced some increase in cohabitation or living outside of marriage. But what I think is really fascinating is that there's such variation across the continent, with 2/3 of births now born outside of marriage in Norway and Sweden. But it's much, much rarer in Italy, other parts of southern
Italy,
Europe.
much more conservative. I was quite surprised when I looked at the figures compared to America, because when we talk about pace of change, perhaps not as fast as Europe. But just explain that.
Well, in America, it's a slightly different phenomenon, and indeed, in each of these countries, cohabitation is rather unique in what it means and who's practicing it. In the U.S., it tends to be much more a pattern of disadvantage. In Europe, it is as well, but we're finding that it's the low-income people, those with less education, who are much less likely to marry, and those people with higher education are more likely to marry. So there are some similarities, but of course there's just quite a lot of variation across both.
Let me bring in Karen. I mean, you're one of the UK's leading wedding bloggers. What are the sorts of trends that you are seeing?
Well, just watching that film, I feel it makes me realise how lucky we are in the UK to get married at whatever age we want, choose not to get married, lead a single life. That's perfectly respected. There's absolutely very little pressure from parents of our generation to get married. In terms of trends, I think the internet is sort of breaking the walls down, and far more interracial marriages, interfaith marriages are considered very acceptable. You know, we're so lucky here in the West to have the opportunity to sort of really be true to ourselves and go with what we feel is right for us, rather than being dictated to by what society expects.
Zaki, you touched on it a little earlier, just in terms of independence, in terms of jobs, in terms of education. I mean, part of the problem isn't necessarily the enrolment of girls in education, it's actually getting them to stay there a little later on, isn't it?
That's right. So there is a time during the adolescence of girls when they start to face a strong social pressure to marry. And this could be about 15 or 16 in India and Bangladesh, or slightly higher in Pakistan. And so this comes from some sort of social norms, which would say that girls should marry at a relatively early age. And so because parents face this social pressure, it's difficult for them to give agency or freedom to their daughters, and to some extent their sons, to make their own marriage decisions. And this is a phenomenon which has to be...
There are sub-trends. In Pakistan, women get married later than India, Bangladesh. Why, briefly, on that?
So what we know is that there has been an increase in the age of marriage in Pakistan over time. And the trends have been much slower in India and Bangladesh. We don't know very well why there has been a faster trend in Pakistan.
Brianna, just in terms of how marriage is now valued, that is fascinating in terms of the sorts of research you've done. I mean, when you look at Germany and how they view it, am I right in saying there was one respondent who just sort of compared it to changing their status on Facebook?
Yes. Well, that was a respondent in Eastern Germany, where again, people tend to think that marriage is irrelevant. They might have a small party, they might do it for legal reasons, but overall, it's not as important as in other parts of Europe, where it does tend to stay relatively important.
Can I also add that I think the advances in fertility treatment are changing the landscape of marriage, and that women do not feel the need to get married to have children, even do not feel the need to have a partner, you know.
And you touched on social media.
Yes.
I mean, that is changing the landscape of not just
Absolutely.
marriage, every sort of relationship.
Well, absolutely, and I'm very interested in what you're saying, Zaki, because a very interesting story that came about via my blog was a woman in India who found herself attracted to women. She wants to be with a woman, and her parents are absolutely against it. She wrote to me after she saw a wedding featured on my blog between a Hindu woman and a Jewish woman, and wanted me to put her in touch with this Hindu woman to be able to show her parents that lesbians can be happy and married.
And so you talked about the sort of lack of quick change in that part of the world. Do you anticipate, with the explosion of social media, that perhaps that will accelerate all the change that we're talking about, or not necessarily?
It's very hard to say. So the important point to keep in mind is that it's very difficult for young women to make these unorthodox choices individually on their own, when all their peers are making very traditional choices. So in the video that we saw, so it's actually very difficult for Naima to be making the kind of choices that she's making. So if there is a possibility of a collective change of all girls in a particular cohort changing their decisions in a certain way, that makes it easier for everyone to do that, at the same time. But individually, it's actually a very difficult thing to do.
Yeah. Just a final question to you, Karen. We're literally out of time, but you've written something, a fantastic phrase I latched onto. Women will marry the right man at any time. Men will marry any woman at the right time. Just explain that, unravel that for me.
Oh gosh, well that's just from, I got married very late, in my late 30s, late for what I anticipated I'd get married, and it's just something I saw that, I always wanted to get married. If I would have met the right guy at the right time, great, at any time. Whereas I felt that what I've seen with men during my dating years is if they're not got their head around the idea of marriage, it doesn't matter if you're their ideal, they're just not ready. But when they are ready, you've got to hope you're that girl that they potentially have a date with, if they're the right guy for you. That's my experience in London, the dating scene.
Well, listen, all three of you, we've run out of time, but thank you so much for coming in and discussing this with me today. Well,